Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
What's the meaning of negotiations when you impose sanctions at the same time? It's like someone pulling a knife to stab a rival or an enemy in the arm, while at the same time claiming we should be talking and negotiating. The answer in such a case would be to say, remove the knife from the arm and put the knife away.
A nuclear standoff builds with Iran as the Trump administration reimposes economic sanctions following Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. We'll get response from Ambassador Sayed Hossein Mousavian, former spokesman for Iran and its nuclear negotiations with the European Union, author of Iran and the United States, an insider's view on the failed past and the road to peace. Then, as more than 100 wildfires rage across the United States, we go to Colorado, where protesters interrupted a speech by Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke and asked him why he refuses to acknowledge the role of climate change.
Secretary Zinke, why won't you acknowledge that climate change is causing and accelerating wildfires, even in Route County?
We'll speak with the protesters in Steamboat Springs who interrupted Zinke, as well as political reporter Ben Lefebvre, who's been doing a series of exposés on the Interior Secretary, who faces 14 investigations, almost as many as there were against the disgraced former EPA chief, Scott Pruitt. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. South Korean President Moon Jae-in has announced he will head to Pyongyang next month for a third summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Moon will become just the third South Korean president to travel to the North Korean capital. The meeting comes at a time when tension appears to be increasing again between the Trump administration and North Korea. Last week, National Security Advisor John Bolton accused North Korea of not taking the steps the Trump administration feels are necessary to denuclearize. In Washington, D.C., a white supremacist rally outside the White House largely fizzled Sunday when just over 24 people showed up for the Unite the Right protest. They were vastly outnumbered by counter-protesters, journalists, and police officers. Sunday's Unite the Right rally came a year after the deadly white supremacist protest in Charlottesville, Virginia. President Trump marked the anniversary of Charlottesville by writing on Twitter, "I condemn all types of racism." Shortly after the deadly Charlottesville protests last year, Trump said there were very fine people on both sides. A Baltimore police officer has resigned after a video went viral showing him repeatedly punching a man in the face before taking him to the ground and continuing to beat him. Officer Arthur Williams was initially suspended from the force but then resigned Sunday. The victim of the police beating, Deshaun McGreer, was taken to the hospital for possible fractures of the jaw, nose, and ribs. McGreer's attorney, Warren Brown, said, quote, "It seems like this officer had just decided that Deshaun was going to be his punching bag, and this was a brutal attack that was degrading and demeaning to my client, to that community, and to the police department." Baltimore Mayor Catherine Pugh describes the video as, quote, "very disturbing." Black Lives Matter activist DeRay McKesson tweeted, "And this is why folks don't have any faith in the police." President Trump's heading to Fort Drum, New York today to sign a record-setting $716 billion military spending bill. That's an $82 billion increase over the current year. The bill includes over $21 billion for nuclear weapons programs, including $65 million for a new submarine-launched low-yield nuclear weapon. In Afghanistan, a fierce battle is continuing over the control of the strategic city of Ghazni 4 days after the Taliban attacked the city, killing more than 200 people, including over 100 soldiers and police officers. Many residents have fled the city.
There were burning buildings and fire and dead bodies everywhere in Ghazni city, and the fight was ongoing. The situation was very bad, and all the shops were closed.
Afghan President Ashraf Ghani announced today more troops will be sent to Ghazni, which is a 2-hour drive from Kabul. Israeli forces shot dead 2 Palestinians during protests in Gaza Friday. 307 Palestinians were injured. The dead included a 22-year-old medic named Abdullah al-Khatati, who was shot in the chest while treating another Palestinian man who'd been fatally wounded. Al-Khatati became the 3rd medic to be shot dead in Gaza since the Great March of Return protests began in March. One of al-Khatati's colleagues said, quote, yes, Abdullah was armed. He was armed with bandages and surgical masks. The United Nations has revealed it has received reports China is holding over 1 million ethnic Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in what resembles a massive internment camp in the western Xinjiang Autonomous Region. According to the group China Human Rights Defenders, more than 20% of all arrests in China last year occurred in Xinjiang, even though the region makes up less than 2% of China's population. China's rejected the internment camp reports, but an editorial in a state-backed newspaper says China's actions in Xinjiang have helped prevent the region from becoming China's Syria or China's Libya. In news from Latin America, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has said he would allow FBI agents into Venezuela to help investigate the recent assassination attempt against him. 2 drones loaded with explosives detonated over Maduro as he gave a nationally televised speech August 4th. Maduro says he believes the plotters of the attack have fled to Florida, Peru, and Colombia. In news from Washington, D.C., the White House is looking at ways to legally prevent former staffer Omarosa Amanagold-Newman from releasing more audio recordings made while she was a staffer at the White House. On Sunday, Meet the Press aired a recording the former reality star made of Chief of Staff John Kelly firing her inside the West Wing.
We've got to talk to you about leaving the White House. It's come to my attention over the last few months that there's been some pretty, in my opinion, significant integrity.
She said she made that recording inside the Situation Room. Up until her firing, Omarosa was President Trump's most prominent African-American advisor in the White House. In her new book, she describes the president as racist and claims he's used the N-word repeatedly. A jury in California has ordered Monsanto to pay $289 million in damages to a school groundskeeper who developed cancer after regularly using the Roundup weed killer. The 46-year-old man, Dwayne Johnson, has non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Doctors say he's unlikely to live past 2020. Judge Suzanne Ramos Bolanos read the jury's verdict.
Was the Roundup Pro or Ranger Pro design a substantial factor in causing harm to Mr. Johnson? Answer, yes.
Monsanto faces more than 5,000 similar lawsuits around the country involving Roundup and other weed killers containing glyphosate. The airline industry is re-examining security protocols after an airport worker at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport stole a plane Friday night, took off without permission, then flew it for about an hour before crashing. Richard Russell was the only person on board when he crashed the 76-seat Horizon airplane. He died in the crash. In other airline news, the Transportation Security Administration is considering a plan to eliminate security checkpoints at more than 150 smaller regional U.S. airports. In news from Minnesota, outgoing Democratic Congressmember Keith Ellison's denying accusations he abused an ex-girlfriend. On Saturday, the woman's son posted a message on Facebook saying he'd seen a video of Ellison dragging his mother off a bed while screaming at her. Ellison said in a statement, "This video doesn't exist because I never behaved in this way, and any characterization otherwise is false," he said. On Sunday, Ellison's ex-girlfriend wrote on Twitter, "What my son said is true. Every statement he made was true." Congressmember Ellison is currently running to become Minnesota's next Attorney General. The Democratic primary is tomorrow. And the Egyptian-born Marxist economist Samir Amin has died at the age of 86. He was considered to be one of Africa's leading radical intellectuals and one of the pioneers of describing modern human history from the perspective of the Global South. He appeared on Democracy Now! From Tunisia in 2015.
Oligarchy is not a specificity, say, of Russia today. You have an oligarchy running the United States, running the European Union and the countries of the European Union. You have oligarchies also running the dependent countries of Latin America, Africa, Asia, everywhere, oligarchy.
To see the interview in its entirety, you can go to democracynow.org, and those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin with a look at escalating tensions between the United States and Iran. On Sunday, the U.S. ambassador to Britain, Woody Johnson, wrote an op-ed in The Telegraph urging Britain to withdraw its support of the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Ambassador Johnson wrote, "America's turning up the pressure and we want the U.K. by our side." Johnson's op-ed comes after the Trump administration reimposed economic sanctions against Iran last week, following Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. The sanctions increased tensions between the U.S. and Iran and the U.S. and its European allies. Trump's threatened other countries seeking to trade with Iran, tweeting, "Anyone doing business with Iran will not be doing business with the United States," unquote. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani condemned the sanctions as psychological warfare, saying last week he would not begin negotiations until the sanctions are withdrawn.
The first step would be for U.S. President Donald Trump to show that he genuinely wants to engage in negotiations to solve a problem. What's the meaning of negotiations when you impose sanctions at the same time? It's like someone pulling a knife to stab a rival or an enemy in the arm, while at the same time claiming we should be talking and negotiating. The answer in such a case would be to say, remove the knife from the arm and put the knife away.
Just last month, President Trump said he would meet with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani whenever Rouhani wants without preconditions. This is Trump speaking at a White House conference just 2 weeks ago.
I do believe that they will probably end up wanting to meet, and I'm ready to meet anytime they want to. And I don't do that from strength or from weakness. I think it's an appropriate thing to do. If we could work something out that's meaningful, not the waste of paper that the other deal was, I would certainly be willing to meet.
Do you have preconditions for that meeting?
No preconditions, no. They want to meet, I'll meet. Anytime they want. Anytime they want. It's good for the country, good for them, good for us, and good for the world. No preconditions. If they want to meet, I'll meet.
Only hours later, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced a slew of preconditions for a possible meeting, including Iran being willing to enter into a new nuclear deal. Well, for more, we're joined now by Ambassador Sayed Hossein Mousavian, Middle East security and nuclear policy specialist at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. From 2003 to 2005, he served as spokesperson for Iran in its nuclear negotiations with the European Union. He's author of The Iranian Nuclear Crisis, a memoir, and most recently, Iran and the United States, an insider's view on the failed past and the road to peace. Ambassador, welcome back to Democracy Now! Thank you for joining us from Princeton University. Why don't we start off with the latest news? You have the U.S. ambassador to Britain, Woody Johnson, pressuring Britain to pull out of the U.S. nuclear deal following the United States, which Trump did, and the imposition of sanctions by the United States last week on Iran.
As you know, the Iranian nuclear deal was the result of 13 years of negotiation between Iran and the world powers. The U.S. engaged the negotiation in 2013 and had also bilateral meetings, intrusive, frequent bilateral meetings from 2013 to 2015. Ultimately, Iran and the U.S., Iran and the world powers agreed on the nuclear deal. The United Nations Security Council passed a resolution approving the deal, and 2 years after the deal, Iran has fully complied with all its commitments. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the sole agency responsible for supervising the nuclear program of member states, has 11 times since 2016 confirmed Iran full compliance with the nuclear deal. Now, the U.S. is the only UN Security Council member withdrew from the deal, violated the deal. This is bad. This is a big mistake. This is violation of international law and regulations by the United States of America. However, what you mentioned, the U.S. ambassador wrote an op-ed in London pressuring the UK to join the U.S. to violate the United Nations Security Council and to withdraw from the deal. The U.S. is doing such a move with every European member. The U.S. is pushing all international community, all other countries. And this is really something very strange and perhaps unprecedented. The United States is the most powerful country in the world and the most powerful member of United Nations Security Council, which all 5 permanent members are responsible for full implementation of the UN Security Council resolutions passed by themselves. Now, not only the U.S. is violating the deal itself, but pushing the other international, other countries, other members of Permanent Security Council to violate the UN Security Council. This is really something unprecedented and very, very strange, and at the same time, very dangerous for international peace, order, and security.
And can you talk about the effects of the sanctions reimposed last week by President Trump against Iran?
I would say there would be an effect on Iranian economy. Iranians definitely would be harmed. I have no doubt about it. Already we have seen some negative consequences on the Iranian economy. However, I need to mention perhaps 3 points. The first point is the fact that Iran has been under U.S. sanctions for 40 years. Therefore, I can say Iranians are the most experienced country and nation on the U.S. sanctions. They have been able to handle the U.S. sanctions, international sanctions, multilateral sanctions, and survive and continue their strategies domestically or regionally or internationally. The second point is that during the first term of President Obama, the U.S. was able to create international consensus to bring UN Security Council sanctioning Iran. It means it was international consensus. Russia agreed, China agreed. It was because there was 6 UN resolutions that on Iranian nuclear program, which Iran was not ready to accept. However, this time, while the deal has been achieved, while Iran has signed, the U.S. signed, the other permanent members of United Nations Security Council, they signed, the UN passed resolution, and Iran has fully complied with every commitment. Now the U.S. is practically isolated to bringing new sanctions or reimposing the sanctions, and therefore the other countries like Russia, China, Europe, India, they are not going to violate the United Nations Security Council, and they are going to continue business with Iran. Therefore, I believe President Trump would not be able to create international consensus reimposing the new sanctions. This is the second issue. The third issue, which is, I believe, more important, Iranian economy is under many difficulties, like corruption, like dysfunctionality, like smuggling, like inflation, and they have a lot of problems. This has been problems since 1979 when Saddam invaded Iran. Iran had 8 years war, and after war, the U.S. pushed for many sanctions against Iran. However, I believe at least 50% of Iranian domestic economic problem is not because of the sanctions. They are because of the domestic dysfunctionality of different systems, whether this is the government or other system. Therefore, if Iran is going to resist the sanctions, they would need to address the dysfunctionalities of their own system. Therefore, this is one reality about dysfunctionality of Iranian domestic economic system. The other reality is that the U.S. is not going to be able to create international consensus, and therefore I believe Iran would be harmed, but President Trump would fail to capitulate Iran to come to negotiation on their sanctions and pressures.
Well, let me ask you about President Trump and his increasing threats against Iran. Last month, he tweeted to Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, "Never, ever threaten the United States again, or you'll suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before." This was in all caps. Later, National Security Advisor John Bolton doubled down, saying, quote, "President Trump told me if Iran does anything at all to the negative, they will pay a price like few countries have ever paid before." Unquote. This comes after, in May, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo using his first policy address as Secretary of State to threaten Iran with the strongest sanctions in history. This is what he said.
"We will apply unprecedented financial pressure on the Iranian regime. The leaders in Tehran will have no doubt about our seriousness. Thanks to our colleagues at the Department of Treasury, sanctions are going back in full effect and new ones are coming. Last week, we imposed sanctions on the head of Iran's central bank and other entities that were funneling money to the IRGC Quds Force. They were also providing money to Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations."
So that's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Ambassador Sayed Hossein Mousavian, talk about what this means, and also the possibility that President Trump might meet with Rouhani in a kind of side meeting in New York at the UN General Assembly when world leaders come.
Let me respond to your questions. You have two questions. The first one is about threatening. I believe threatening is really bad, is against the United Nations Charter. Whether if Iran is threatening the U.S. or the U.S. is threatening the Iranians. This is a clear violation of the UN security, the UN Charter. However, the fact is that President Trump started to threaten Iran. The first threatening was violation of the nuclear deal, violation of United Nations Security Council resolution, violation of 11 resolutions of the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. The second threat came by President Trump administration was the official statement by John Bolton and Pompeo for regime change in Iran. They frequently mentioned that they are after regime change in Iran. The third threat from the U.S. side was when the U.S. said they are going to bring Iranian oil export to zero. Therefore, I think already President Trump clicked the trend of threatening by regime change strategy, by all options on the table, including military strike on Iran, by sanctioning Iran, by violating the nuclear deal, and by, for the first time, it was a statement from the United States of America to say that they are going to bring Iranian oil export to zero. Even during the war, Saddam invasion of Iran, 1980 to 1988, when the U.S. was supporting Saddam in war against Iran, never the U.S. said that I'm going to bring Iranian oil export to zero. That's why I believe President Trump has gone beyond threatening Iran. President Trump publicly has announced economic war, political war with Iran, short of military war. Therefore, Iranians also, they would respond and they would threaten the U.S. by closing the Strait of Hormuz in order not to let any other country to export oil if Iran is not permitted to export oil. That's why a threat is against threat, came for the first time from the U.S. side. Now, about your second question, whether any negotiation would be possible or not. My first response is that while Iran and the U.S. already agreed on a deal, and the U.S. violated how Iranians, they can trust the U.S. to enter a new negotiation. Let's say there would be a new negotiation. Let's say there would be an agreement with President Trump. Who can guarantee the next U.S. president would not come and would not violate it? President Obama agreed. It was not bilateral agreement. It was international agreement. It had UN resolution. Despite of all this, President Trump, after Obama, publicly said it was a bad mistake and I'm going to kill it. How the U.S. can assure Iranians, if there is a negotiation, if there is an agreement, the next U.S. president is not going to do what President Trump did with Obama legacy? This is the first question. Second, what is the base? President Trump, if he really wants a normal relation with Iran, then we have three criteria. The first criteria is a treaty of amity between Iran and the U.S. signed 1955, which is for economic relations and consular rights. Yes, Iran and the U.S., they have many problems about their citizens in Iran, in the U.S., and there is already a treaty between Iran and the U.S. resolving all consular and citizen issues. Yes, President Trump is willing to have a share of the nuclear deal, to have economic share, to have some share for the U.S., but 1955 treaty has defined excellent economic relation between Iran and the U.S. Iran recently has filed a lawsuit against the new sanctions imposed by the U.S. at the International Court in Hague, based on Treaty of Amity 1955. When Iran is filing a lawsuit against the U.S. based on this amity treaty, it means Iran practically recognizes this amity. Now, this can be criteria number one for President Trump to go back to the Treaty of Amity 1955 between Iran and the U.S. The second is 1981 accord between Iran and the U.S. After 25 years of U.S. support for Shah in Iran, dictatorship dominating Iran, there was a revolution. Iranians took some Americans as hostages in Iran. There was a big problem. Ultimately, Iran and the U.S. in 1981 met each other in Algeria, and they signed an accord defining how Iran and the U.S. can have normal relations based on mutual respect and non-interference. This accord was signed between Iran and the U.S. Right after the signature, Iran freed the hostages, and the U.S., rather than implementing this accord for a normal relation with Iran, the U.S. cut the relation with Iran and went to support Saddam Hussein invading Iran, participated in a war against Iran. The third criteria is the nuclear deal signed by the U.S., approved by United Nations Security Council. President Trump should tell Iranians which of these treaties, agreements, accords are going to be criteria for the future of Iran and the U.S. I think Iran and the U.S. already, they have two major accords which really can create a new relation, can be foundation for a new relation between Iran and the U.S. But President Trump should assure Iran about the basis, about the foundation, about the criteria. The U.S. violated 1955 Treaty of Amity. The U.S. violated 1985 Accord. And the U.S. violated the Nuclear Deal 2015. Then what?
What about President Trump threatening any country that does business with Iran, saying the U.S. won't do business with them?
This is exactly what I said, a new an unprecedented phenomenon in international relations, because the nuclear deal has clearly states in the nuclear, you would see in the nuclear deal, stating that all signatories are committed to facilitate normal economic relation with Iran. Therefore, based on the nuclear deal, all signatories, Germany, Europeans, UK, France, Russia, China, and all other countries, including the US, which is the signatory of the deal, is responsible for facilitating normal economic relation of other countries, between other countries and Iran. Now, the US withdrew from the deal, violated the agreement, imposed new sanctions. This is one big issue. A United Nations Security Council is violating its own resolution, the UN resolution. And the second unprecedented phenomena is that the U.S. is pushing the other member states of United Nations Security Council to violate United Nations Security Council resolution to stop business with Iran. Therefore, the U.S. also should tell its own people, international community, is really the United States of America responsible for implementation of United Nations Security Council resolution or blocking of implementation of United Nations Security Council resolutions?
Ambassador Sayed Hossein Mousavian, as you teach at Princeton University, what do you think is the greatest misconception Americans have about Iran?
See, Iran and the U.S., they have had no relation for 40 years. Therefore, it is normal, it is natural that there are many misunderstandings, miscalculations, misperceptions on the American side and even on the Iranian side, to be fair. Iranians also, they really cannot understand exactly what's going on in the U.S. The realities of United States is not well known to Iranians, and more the realities of Iranian domestic situation, political situation is not known to Americans. And unfortunately, the President Trump administration has relied on enemies of Iran like terrorist groups of MEK in Washington, getting their agenda from this terrorist group. They are a terrorist group like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda. The biggest, I think, misperception and misunderstanding is that they think Iran is after destabilizing the region, while Iran is really after stabilizing the region, because at this stable region, Iran would be the first or among the most important countries to suffer. Iran really has invested in Iraq and Syria to fight ISIS in order to bring stability. Iran cooperated with the United States of America 2005 after the U.S. announced war on terror and attacked Afghanistan. Iran shook hands with the United States to cooperate with the U.S. to fight Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan. And after the fall of Saddam, practically Iranian allies, they cooperated with the U.S. to bring a new structure in Iraq, which was based on the rule of majority, power sharing, free election, new constitution. It was exactly what Iran and the U.S. experienced in Afghanistan in a joint cooperation. Iran and the U.S. experienced in Iraq in a joint cooperation. And they have been fighting ISIS together, despite of all animosities and hostilities. Therefore, this is very important for United States of America to understand what real, legitimate security concern Iran has in the region, in order to understand Iranian regional behavior. The second big misunderstanding about on the U.S. policy is that all administrations of United States of America. They had a dual-track policy, pressure and sanction, coercion strategy, and at the same time asking for negotiation. They were thinking Iran would capitulate under pressures and sanctions, and they would come to the negotiation table and they would accept whatever United States is asking. This has been experienced for 40 years by every administration, whether Democrat or Republicans, and all have failed. And now the main U.S. concern today, after 40 years of military war, economic war, political war, intelligence war, covert war, cyber war against Iran, now the main U.S. complaint is that why Iran is the most powerful, most influential country in the region. Now I'm telling President Trump, if United States has experienced every coercion strategies against Iran and failed after 40 years, now why you are going to experience again the policies which already has failed?
Ambassador,
therefore, it's better to go back to the treaties already signed between Iran and the U.S.
I want to thank you so much for being with us. Sayed Hossein Mousavian, Middle East Security and Nuclear Policy Specialist at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, served as spokesperson for Iran in its nuclear negotiations with the European Union from 2003 to 5, author of The Iranian Nuclear Crisis, a memoir, and Iran and the United States, an insider's view on the failed past and the road to peace. When we come back, as more than 100 wildfires rage across the U.S., we go to Colorado to speak with two protesters who interrupted a speech by the most investigated secretary of the Trump administration currently sitting. That's Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. They asked why he refuses to talk about the link between fires and climate change. Stay with us.
There was a massacre in church that got certain forces moving. Many towns are now at least superficially improving, such as in Virginia, where a statue of General Lee stands as a reminder of the days of slavery. In the city center, an indelible mark in the spot that's been renamed Emancipation Park, slated for removal when a judge intervened, which might be the moment that most fully set the scene for 19 injured, 1 killed today in Charlottesville. With their man in the White House, members of the right march.
Today in Charlottesville by Dave Rovix. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to Colorado, where Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke was confronted Friday while he spoke in rural Steamboat Springs at the Freedom Conference, which has featured conservative thought leaders like former Vice President Dick Cheney and Fox News host Laura Ingraham. Just as Zinke began his address, Jesse Brucato stood up and raised a sign that read "Corruption Cream Ale." He asked Zinke a series of questions before fellow diners grabbed him from behind and removed him from the room.
I'm asked oftentimes, what's easier, being a former SEAL Team 6 commander or Department of Interior Secretary? Actually, SEAL was a better job and easier. As a SEAL, when people shout at you, I can shoot back. Interior. I'm honored to be in the President's cabinet. But I can tell you, with this president, you never sit. But Interior is 12 time zones. We stretch from the Virgin Islands all the way to Palau.
Hey, Secretary Zinke, why do you care more about breweries, your own personal brewery, than our public lands? Sit down. Don't touch me, Doctor. Sit down. About our public lands. It's rude that you care more about our fossil fuel buddies than our public lands.
Everybody has a right to talk. Shut the up and go away.
Let's go. Take me out. I'm not fighting. I'm not fighting.
After Jesse Brucato was taken out by fellow diners, Zinke continued his speech focused on the management of public lands, but it was not long before Zinke was interrupted again, this time by Sally Holmes, who had more questions for the Interior Secretary.
Secretary Zinke, why won't you acknowledge that climate change is causing and accelerating accelerating wildfires, even in Route County.
Totally not true.
Why are you cutting the DOI budget for wildfires?
Your child had to fight for energy.
Our communities are suffering because you will not acknowledge climate change.
This is how Secretary Zinke responded to Sally Holmes after she asked why he won't acknowledge climate change is causing and accelerating wildfires.
You know what? You haven't served, and you don't understand what energy is. I'd like to see your child have to fight for energy.
Secretary Zinke served 23 years as a Navy SEAL and represented Montana as a Congress member. But since he became Interior Secretary, Zinke has emerged as one of the most ethically challenged members of President Trump's cabinet, compared to disgraced former EPA Director Scott Pruitt, who faced a record 16 federal investigations into alleged misconduct before he was forced to resign. Zinke has faced 14 federal investigations into his behavior as secretary. We'll talk more about the latest allegations he faces soon, but first we go directly to Steamboat Springs, Colorado, where we're joined by the two people you just heard interrupting Zinke. That's Sally Holmes and Jesse Brucato, both residents of Steamboat Springs, who describe themselves as concerned citizens. Holmes, a graduate of Colorado Mountain College with a degree in sustainability studies. Jesse Brucato, an avid rafting enthusiast. Welcome, both of you, to Democracy Now! Sally, let's begin with you. Talk about your message, how you got into this event, what the event was, and your assessment of Zinke's response.
I got into the event by buying a ticket. Both Jesse and I decided that we needed to be a little more assertive. If you're going to come to Steamboat and only speak to wealthy donors and wealthy citizens, then we decided that we needed a seat at the table as well. His response to me was incredibly angry and intense. I think I really threw him off guard. He didn't stay on my topic. Obviously, he was talking about energy at the time, but he immediately went to that I haven't served in the military, I don't know anything about energy, and my child's going to have to fight for a war. And the reason we were there is to ask a question. You know, you can't be a responsible land manager unless you acknowledge the issues at hand, which include climate change and listening to your stakeholders.
Your own county has been fighting wildfire, Sally?
Yes, we have a fire burning to the east of Steamboat. That's only about 5% contained right now. And the smoke has been billowing into the valley for the past couple weeks, definitely diminishing air quality. And we already have a stage 1 fire ban here as well.
Jesse Brucato, talk about your concerns, what you raised with him. Explain the sign you were holding.
So the sign I held up said corruption cream ale on it. And basically the message that I wanted to get out with that is that Zinke is clearly a corrupt politician, using, private meetings with Halliburton to get something he's always wanted, a brewery, instead of focusing on protecting our public lands, which is something, I deeply care about. I didn't really think that he should be subject to personal gains, through just having a position of power in office.
Well, I wanted to bring Ben Lefebvre into this conversation, who's been doing a series of exposés in Politico around the Interior Secretary. And on this issue of a brewery in Whitefish, Montana, his hometown, can you explain what it is that Jesse was so concerned about? Explain what this brewery is, what the connection is to Halliburton, and what it has to do with the issue of public lands, Ben.
A group of developers in Whitefish, Montana, including the Halliburton chairman and until recently the CEO, Dave Lassar, are bankrolling a proposed development that would include a microbrewery the development would be adjacent to a park that the Zinke's own, Ryan Zinke and his family, run through a foundation they set up about a decade ago. The worries are that through a land deal that the foundation is offering with the developers, including Lassar, the Zinke's may have a chance at operating a microbrewery that's planned for the development. They had a meeting, Dave Lassar and Ryan Zinke, in the Interior Department's headquarters in Zinke's office, where they discussed the development. Zinke would say that they spent 90 minutes talking about the Interior's history. But then after the meeting at the headquarters, they went out to dinner. Zinke took them for a private tour of the Lincoln Memorial. So it really raises questions of conflict of interest.
And this land that the foundation got, the foundation was set up to serve veterans, is that right?
Yeah, the land was given to the Zinkes through the BNSF Railroad about a decade ago. The land was supposed to be used to build a park to honor veterans. The Zinkes have said they would look into doing educational programs for kids with this foundation. But, having visited there twice, there's nothing really there. It's just, a bunch of weeds and grass. There's a rail line, like one of the major rail lines, going right adjacent to the park. About 40 trains a day go by. The Zinkes have said they do a band shell there for summer concerts. Neighbors have said that's not a great idea when you've got, 40 rumbling trains per day going through. So there's a question of what their plans are for this land. There's a retention pond there that eats up most of the available space. I think the latest I've heard is Secretary Zinke's wife saying it would, it's a great dog run, but it's a vacant lot. Any vacant lot, I would imagine, to be a great dog run.
And the business Halliburton has before the Secretary of Interior or the Interior Department?
Halliburton's one of the biggest frackers in the world. Anything they do on public land is going to be regulated by Interior. So we've seen, for instance, Interior trying to roll back, or they actually have rolled back, the fracking rule that the Obama administration put in place. That would save service companies like Halliburton quite a bit of money. The Interior is still trying to roll back a rule that would the Obama administration put in place that would have cut down the methane emissions from pipelines and oil rigs on public lands. And the Interior Department is also now considering rolling back, or in the process of rolling back, safety rules for offshore drilling rigs, which would be another thing that service companies such as Halliburton would, save money from not having to adhere to stricter regulations.
And so this brewery that the Zinkes own is in their business partner is the CEO of Halliburton?
Correct. They don't own the brewery yet. The brewery has been proposed for the land, and Zinke's been trying to get a brewery off the ground since 2012. He first proposed it then, along with a bed and breakfast for the town. But he's been pursuing it pretty much nonstop since then. He's, even as a U.S. congressman in Montana a few years ago, he was, sitting on a planning board committee with the Whitefish City Council and attending meetings to talk about his microbrewery idea. Those plans got shot down because residents, kind of protested, saying this is not something we want in our residential neighborhood. But with this planned microbrewery, that is, when you look at the development maps, it's, marked off as a microbrewery. This raises questions of, is the Halliburton chairman bankrolling a project that the Zinkes would then, be in charge of for, who knows what Halliburton gets out of this. But, if you're the head of the Interior Department, you have things to offer. So it does raise at least the appearance of conflict of interest.
Sally Holmes, can you respond to what Interior Secretary Zinke said about fighting wars for oil?
I think that he just basically removed the smokescreen about fighting wars for democracy and freedom and admitted that they're for oil. And I think that it's extremely irresponsible for him to not only say that, but for him to admit that they're not looking at any type of alternatives. There are other ways, renewable energy, obviously, but we don't need to be sending more Americans, more of our family members and friends across the world to fight for energy when we have the scientific technology to change that here.
As more than 100 fires rage in the western United States, a number of them in Colorado, Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke wrote an op-ed last week in USA Today about forest management on public lands, saying, quote, "Radical environmentalists would have you believe forest management means clear-cutting forests and national parks, but their rhetoric could not be further from the truth. They make outdated and unscientific arguments void of facts because they cannot defend the merits of their policy preferences year after year as our forests and homes burn to the ground," Zinke wrote. His op-ed came out after confusion about President Trump's claim in a tweet that California's water, which could be used for firefighting, was instead being diverted into the Pacific Ocean, which experts criticized completely and debunked. Your response, Sally?
I think that regardless of what he thinks about environmentalists or the left or anything like that, this is a political spectrum spanning issue. The majority of Americans care about our public lands, and I think that we really only want a seat at the table, and a responsible land manager is not going to make the enemy out of anybody and is going to listen to A, the scientific community, and B, the citizens as well.
And who took you out, Sally Holmes? Was it the diners you were around, or was it security? Who forced you out?
It was actually an attendee who got up from his seat and came over and grabbed me around the neck and brought me back to the door to the exit, where I was met by security.
Do you call yourself a protester, Jesse Brocato?
I wouldn't say I'm particularly a political activist, but when I heard Zinke was coming through town, I figured somebody had to do something, and, you know, it was a good opportunity to kind of put my money where my mouth is and stand up for what I believe in.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with us, Sally Holmes and Jesse Brocato. They both engaged in this first time direct action, standing up at a dinner for Interior Secretary Zinke in Steamboat Springs. Ben Lefebvre, I'd like to ask you to stay with us after break. We'll also be joined by a former Interior Department employee for years who ultimately left under the Trump administration. Stay with us.
Indigenous people, shine your light, we are equal, yeah, yeah. I remember the days when our prayers were illegal. I remember the days when being Indian was lethal, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we had a rough past, but get ready for the sequel. Get ready for the glorious comeback of the people, oh, yeah. Rise up, all you warriors of love, all you answers to the prayers of our ancestors from above. I can feel it in my heart. Can you feel it in your blood? I can hear the seventh fire calling us to wake up. All nations rise. Rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's our time.
Lila June, DNA activist and performer, singing at the Stand for Our Land rally in Steamboat Springs, Colorado last Friday. Local papers, from the Steamboat Pilot to the Aspen Times, estimate around 1,400 people came to this as Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke was speaking at a $1,000 per person gathering at Steamboat Springs Ski Resort. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As more than 100 fires rage in the western United States, Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke wrote an op-ed last week in USA Today about forest management on public lands, again saying, quote, "Radical environmentalists would have you believe forest management means clear-cutting forests and national parks, but their rhetoric could not be further from the truth. They make outdated and unscientific arguments void of facts because they cannot defend the merits of their policy preferences year after year as our forests and homes burn to the ground," Zinke wrote. That was last week. Well, after Zinke was interrupted Saturday at his speech in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. He went to Northern California, where the deadly Carr fire has destroyed more than 1,000 homes, spoke again about wildfires and climate change and what he called extreme environmentalists. A clip from an interview in the local station KCRA3 in California.
I've heard the climate change, argument back and forth. This has nothing to do with climate change. This has to do with active forest management. The extreme environmentalists that, again, have shut down public access. They talk about habitat, and yet they're willing to let it burn up.
For more, we are joined via Democracy Now! Video stream from Maine by Joel Clement, who served as director of the Office of Policy Analysis at the U.S. Interior Department until, 1 year ago, July 2017. He worked at the Interior Department for 7 years, now a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And still with us in Washington, D.C. is Ben Lefebvre, energy reporter for Politico, with stories recently headlined Interior IG to scrutinize Zinke's beer-making plans, an exclusive Zinke linked to real estate deal with Halliburton chairman. Ben, before we go to Joel Clement, formerly with the Interior Department, is it true that Ryan Zinke is currently, now that Scott Pruitt is out, the most investigated secretary of the Trump administration with 14 investigations ongoing?
Correct. He's had investigations almost from the start with his travel, use of charter planes, and going to political fundraisers as during travel. There were, was put about by his official role as secretary. So he's had quite a number of investigations. It almost averages out like 1 or 2 per month of his tenure there.
And if you could talk about this comment about radical environmentalists and in the tradition of the Trump administration, his fierce climate denialism.
Yeah. His remarks about the wildfires is interesting in that, Montana had a major wildfire not too long ago, a few years ago. If you go to Glacier National Park, you can still see the scars on the mountainsides where, a lot of the trees had burned down. And so the wildfires gets to be an issue among Montana politicians. But while I've been told that, the removing the, waste trees or, the down trees from the forest, there's a policy debate to be had on that. Zinke and some other Montana Republicans, including Senator Steve Daines, kind of use this phrase radical environmentalists quite often. And what I've been told by folks in Montana is that's somewhat of a political dog whistle for Zinke and Daines to reach out to far-right constituencies in Montana, some of the anti-government folks out there, the folks that may be sympathetic to the Bundy incident with the ranchers kind of fighting with the government employees. It's kind of a way to shore up votes for their, when they run for office. There's been speculation that Zinke may run for governor in Montana in 2020. So this might be a way for him to kind of use a bullhorn to, perk the ears up of those folks.
Joel Clement, you left the Interior Department under Zinke. Can you explain why? And also, in listening to this conversation, if you can comment on his latest, corporate venture he wants to engage in, this brewery on public land.
Yeah, Amy, I left the agency last fall after last summer dozens of senior executives were reassigned suddenly in a late night email. I blew the whistle on that because it was clearly, in my view, retaliation for my work on climate change issues. I resigned a few months later, and I have to say I kind of pined for those days when we were just worried about discrimination and retaliation last summer, because now, as your other speakers have noted, we're getting into some unethical and potentially unlawful behavior. So things have changed quite a lot. And
well, in your area of expertise, in this last minute we have on this issue of climate change, if you can comment on what the Secretary is saying and if it surprises you.
It doesn't surprise me. That's where they're coming from right now. They're clearly not going to acknowledge climate change, but it is important. The right answer to Americans right now who are worried about safety in the face of wildfire or other extreme events is to say we're working on protecting Americans, not we need to we need to get rid of these extreme environmentalists and go logging out in the forest. We need to protect communities. We need to protect our infrastructure. We need to start paying attention closely to the impacts of climate change, because we understand that most Americans get it, that climate change is no longer something that they can just wish away in this administration.
Well, Joel Clement, we want to thank you for being with us. Served in the Department of Interior until he quit last year. And I want to thank Ben Lefebvre. We will link to your articles in Politico, energy reporter there, doing a series of exposés on the current Secretary of the Interior. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is job opening for a full-time broadcast engineer. Check our website at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.